Welcome to The Criminal Imagination, where we explore crime not just as an act, but as a metaphor, a rupture, a system, a silence. And today we are stepping into one of the most haunting motifs in all of fiction, one that slips under the skin and stays there, the vanished child. Let me ask you something. Why do we keep writing stories where children go missing? Not just in detective thrillers, not just in horror or true crime. I mean, across genres, across cultures, through folklore, myth, and contemporary fiction, why is the child so often the one who disappears? Who is kidnapped, hunted, ghosted, mourned, or worse, forgotten? This isn't just about crime. This is about the collective terror of losing something pure, something uncorrupted, something that can't defend itself against the machinery of the world. In this two-part deep dive, I will focus on the two devastating, delicate, brilliant novels Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line by Deepa Anappara and Tokyo Ueno Station by Miri. Both books feature lost children, but the real story is about the world that lets them disappear. And the parents, either present or absent, who are left helpless, broken, ghost like themselves. I will be discussing plot points in depth, no gentle summary here. We are going in bare-handed, page by page. And if you haven't read these books, pause this, read them, come back, or stay and let me ruin you gently. Let's begin with the echo. Across global literature, the motif of the vanished child isn't new, it's ancient. From fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel to Toni Morrison's Beloved, to Room, to the lovely Bones, to Never Let Me Go, children vanish. Sometimes physically, sometimes symbolically, but always it means something more. It's not just about fear, it's about what the child stands for: innocence, future, hope. When fiction loses a child, it's telling us something about what we have lost. When a child vanishes, it's the plot's way of saying this world is no longer safe. Not just unsafe for children, but unsafe for meaning, unsafe for belief. That's the real crime, and that's what we'll dig into now. Let's start with Gin Patrol on the Purple Line. At first glance, it reads almost playful, narrated by the 9-year-old Jay who believes he can solve the case of the disappearing children in his slum like a junior detective. It feels warm, it feels clever, and then it starts to rot. Children vanish, one after the other, and Jay keeps chasing shadows, first suspects, then rumors, then jinns. At one point, he says, "If I become a detective, I can find the children." The tragedy is that the only people taking these disappearances seriously are the children themselves. The adults are tired, poor, powerless. The police are lazy, corrupt. The state is a ghost. So what's left? Superstition, hope, and denial. What begins as a playful investigation turns into a horror story because the real monster is structural. The real gin is the smog, the neglect, the casual invisibility of the poor. And then we cross the ocean in Tokyo. In Yumiri's Tokyo Inno Station, the child does not vanish, he dies. But what follows is worse. The protagonist, Kazu, a laborer from Fukushima, loses his young son to illness. Then, like water through cracked stone, everything else collapses: his job, his identity, his sense of time. He ends up homeless in Ueno Park, and even in death he cannot leave. He becomes a ghost, narrating from the afterlife, watching the living pass by him, watching tourists take pictures on the grass under which his bones lie buried. His son's death, barely a chapter, echoes through the whole novel. It is the silent detonation of life. The grief is not explosive, it's erasure. The dead do not care if they are remembered or forgotten, but fiction does. That's why this book exists, and that's what links both books together. They are not stories about children, they are stories about what the world does when it loses them. Let's take a step back. Fiction is a mirror, but sometimes it's a cracked one. And in that crack, we see what systems do when they fail. Which brings me to the framing question: who watches the margins when the center fails? Because that's where these children vanish, in the margins: slums, parks, stations, wastelands, places where nobody looks unless something is already burning. And when a child vanishes in fiction, it's the story's way of forcing us to look. But we resist. We want resolution. We want the detective to find the clue. We want Jay to rescue someone. We want Kazu to come back to life and scream at the state that abandoned him. But that's not how these stories end, because that's not how real life works. Both Gin Patrol and Ueno Station deny us catharsis. That's the genius. That's the cruelty. They make us feel the ambiguous loss, that peculiar pain of not knowing, not fixing, not solving. Because sometimes the worst crimes leave no villain, just silence. We will continue this in the part 2 with a deeper dive into the psychology of parental helplessness, grief, and ghosthood. We will look at ambiguous loss, the mythic and philosophical stakes, and why some children in fiction disappear not into the forest but into a narrative fog. But for now, just sit with this. A boy who thinks he's a detective, a father who becomes a ghost, a world that looks away, and fiction standing over the missing poster saying, "Don't look away this time." First, we slip deeper into the smoke laced streets of a city that never names itself, following the scent of something foul. No, not just death, not just disappearance, but systemic silence. In this episode, we dissect Deepa Annapanna's Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line, a novel that disguises itself at first glance as a child's play. You think you are entering a whimsical story: a 9-year-old boy, a missing classmate, a dusty bazaar, and a trail of footprints. It even has a cadence of a schoolyard adventure. But by the time you are halfway through, you realize you have been tricked. That the narrator's innocence is not a softening filter, but a blade that cuts far deeper than adult cynicism ever could. The premise is deceptively simple. Children are vanishing from a basti, an informal slum settlement on the outskirts of a large unnamed Indian city. These disappearances go unreported, uninvestigated, and largely unnoticed by the structures meant to protect them. There is no public outcry, no headlines, no alerts. The police are lazy, sometimes hostile, and most often indifferent. For them, these are not children, they are statistical noise, dust. Into this vacuum steps our narrator Jay, 9 years old, wide eyed, mouthy, endlessly imaginative. He has watched enough crime shows, especially Police Patrol, to believe that a child like him can be a detective. He declares, If I become a detective, I can find the children. And with that line, the novel performs a trick of a narrative tension so complex it demands our attention, not just emotionally, but psychologically, politically, and philosophically. Because what Annappara constructs here is not a child's eye view of a mystery, it's a child's belief that mystery can be solved if only someone cares enough to try. That belief, that brittle growing filament of hope is what will haunt you more than any monster could ever. As a literary voice, Jay is stunning, not because he is precocious, but because he is believably limited. He does not fully understand the systems operating around him, but he absorbs their consequences. He notices things he cannot name. The strange pauses in adult speech, the changing tone of the local priest, the flare of the temper in his father when money runs out, the presence of police and cameras only when the rich are involved. His world is shaped by television, folk tales, gossip, and myth, but it is also riddled with absences. And here is the novel's masterstroke. Annaparna does not use Jay to protect the reader from the brutality of what is happening. She uses him to magnify it because we know more than he does, and we feel the dread built long before he does. As readers, we experience what psychologists call dramatic irony trauma, when the character's innocence becomes our suffering. Jay's misreading of events becomes unbearable, not because he is foolish, but because he is hopeful. He believes that being clever is enough, that if he interviews enough people, if he follows the trail, if he draws a map and names the suspects, he will bring the children home. This is not just narrative tension, it is false hope weaponized as horror. One of the most painful moments come when Jay is forced to look inside a refrigerator abandoned in the garbage field where they believe a missing girl might be. He tries to convince himself it will be empty. It must be empty. It cannot hold what it fears. The delay, the fear, the desperate mental gymnastics of a child trying to delay the end of innocence. These are not melodrama, these are psychological realism of the highest order. What Annapurna exposes here is the fragility of childhood when left unprotected. And more than that, she shows how the fragility is compounded when adults have neither the means nor the will to intervene. Jay is not alone. He has friends. Pari, a brilliant classmate who balances his boyish bluster with biting realism, and Faiz, whose older brother has already vanished. Each child brings a different angle, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, to this case, and yet none of their tools are enough. They are up against a system not just broken but designed to forget them. This brings us to the philosophical backbone of the novel. What happens when the state abdicates its most basic duty, protection of the vulnerable? In this absence, mythology steps in. The children speak of jinns, spirits, shadowy beings who take children away. At first, these are jokes. Later, they are metaphors. And eventually, they become terrifyingly plausible. Because when no one is held accountable, when no justice is visible, when no truth emerges, myth becomes a way to cope. It is tempting as readers in privileged contexts to dismiss the Jinn theory as superstition, but that would be a mistake. The Jinns in Jinn Patrol are not just stand ins for the unknown, they are symbols of systematic invisibility. The state vanishes, The police vanish, the news cameras never arrive. So, of course, the explanation must also vanish into myth, into smoke, into the shape of a creature that cannot be seen or punished. What's more chilling is that even Jay begins to believe. He hasn't abandoned logic, but logic doesn't work here. Reason doesn't protect here. And when that happens, myth isn't a fantasy, it is a necessity. There is also something else here. Anappara doesn't just write about poverty, she writes about the performance of poverty. How children learn early on to laugh at hunger, to gamify danger, to decorate trauma with imagination. Jay jokes, he makes lists, he mimics television heroes, not because he doesn't understand grief, but because understanding it would break him and maybe us. There is a line towards the latter half of the novel after several children are gone and Jay's detective logic has failed and Faiz is no longer speaking. Jay says, we don't talk about what happened, not because we have forgotten, but because we don't want the memory to come out and sit with us. This is the kind of line that rewires a reader's understanding. Grief is not about memory. Grief is about the weight of memory that is not allowed to sit down. In the world of this novel, there is no space for public mourning, no posters, no vigils, no trials, just gossip, whispers, and eventually silence. So, what do we do with a book like this? We acknowledge it not as a simple story, but as an indictment. Gin Petrol on the Purple Line is not a novel that asks you to cry. It asks you to see, to look where the camera doesn't, to hear the voices that don't speak English, to recognize that hope in the mouth of a child can become the cruelest device in literature when no one listens, and to recognize finally that this isn't a dystopia, this is the present, this is real. Deepa Anappara was a journalist before she wrote fiction. Her reporting across India showed her again and again how children vanished and how few people noticed. What she has done here is transform that silence into story. It's unbearable, it's essential. And now let me take you to Tokyo Ueno Station, where the child is not missing but dead, and the father becomes the ghost. But the question remains the same. When the child disappears, who mourns them properly? Who remembers them fully? And who profits from their absence? Because make no mistake, someone always does. The first time I read Tokyo Inno Station, I didn't cry. That came later. What I felt in that first reading was something harder to name. A stillness that wasn't peace, a kind of suffocation, as if I had stumbled into a room that had been sealed shut for decades and dared to breathe in the air. That's what Miri achieves in this short spectral novel. A grief so quiet, so abandoned by ritual or language or witness that it begins to float above the page like the ghost itself. The central figure of the novel, Kazu, is already dead when we meet him, or rather, he has become aware of his death. He haunts Eno Park, a public green space in Tokyo near the Imperial Palace, once built to display the grandeur of the state. Now it becomes a kind of stage for society's ghosts, the homeless, the lost, the overlooked. Kazu is not a metaphor, he is not an allegory, he is a man. And his haunting is not supernatural in the traditional sense, it is sociological, it is economic. It is the residue of poverty that refuses to evaporate. Kazu once had a home, a family, a job. His life wasn't extraordinary. He worked in construction. He sent money back to Fukushima. His life followed the rules. He did everything right. And still, his son died young. Illness. And from that moment on, something in Kazu unglued. Not all at once. He didn't weep in public or scream at God. There's none of that spectacle here. What Miri gives us is quieter, more devastating. The slow erosion of a man who no longer belongs to the timeline he is in. There is a line in this book. The dead do not care if they are remembered or forgotten. And yet, the entire novel aches with the contradiction of that claim. Kazu does not care, not because he wants a statue or a headline, but because in being forgotten, something more insidious happens. His son's death becomes unstoried. It becomes just one more number in a long, invisible list of tragedies that do not count. And with it, Kazu's life unravels, not in drama but in decay. Here is what makes this novel so cruelly brilliant. Kazu doesn't react to grief the way we have been trained to expect. He doesn't narrate his despair, he doesn't process his trauma, he doesn't reflect on meaning, he simply continues. He moves through jobs, he takes on menial labor, he watches his family drift away, and eventually he stops going home. He doesn't disappear in a cinematic moment. He fades like a garment left too long in the sun. What makes Tokyo Station devastating is not just the loss of a child, it's the loss of a witness. Grief without echo, grief without language. Kazu's mourning is a prolonged precisely because no one recognizes it as mourning. Society does not name his loss, so he is forced to carry it unconsecrated. This is not simply a private story, it's a class story. Yumiri draws a razor sharp line between Kazu's invisibility and the machinery of modern Japan. His homelessness is not a failure of character, it is the byproduct of a system designed to consume labor and discard laborers. When he no longer serves a purpose, he vanishes from record. What remains is a body, nowhere to go. A ghost, not because he died, but because the living no longer looked at him. It is important to understand that Kazu's son is not the only lost child in this novel. Kazu himself becomes one. He becomes the child of a state that has disowned him, a man whose relationship to time becomes fractured. He exists in fragments, memories that rise and fall like breath, location shifts that are both physical and psychological. At times he is watching tourists take photographs. Other times he is remembering his son's hospital bed. Sometimes he is lying in the rain unable to move. There is no chronology here because Kazu is no longer in time. And this is where the philosophical core of the novel takes hold. Can grief survive invisibility or does it become the ghost instead? Most fiction treats mourning as a process, a narrative arc, denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance. But Kazu never gets those stages. What Yumiri gives us instead is a kind of ambient mourning, grief as weather. It doesn't move through stages, it hovers. It never lifts, And because no one sees him, no one recognizes that he's grieving, that he's still a father, that his son is still dead. This is what I mean when I say the book is suffocating. There is no catharsis here, no redemption. Even in death, Kazu cannot find rest. Because rest requires recognition, and ghosts, by definition, are those who were denied it. The psychological precision here is staggering. Kazu suffers from what trauma theorists would call disenfranchised grief, the kind of mourning that society does not acknowledge or validate. There are no rituals for men like him, no language, no listeners, and so the grief metasizes inward. It becomes silence, stillness, dissociation, not screaming, but fading. What Miri does then is radically political. She gives narrative back to a man who was denied it. She turns the invisible into the narrator, and in doing so, she forces us to see what we are trained to look past. Kazu is not a saint. He's not a villain. He's not complex in the literary sense. He's simply present, and that's what makes him radical. He has no grand epiphany, no moral lesson. He's a man who lost a child and who became so thoroughly lost himself that he slipped out of the language of the living. And yet, and here is where the ghost breaks me. He watches, that's all he does. He watches couples walk past. He watches the cherry blossoms bloom and fall. He watches the tents of the homeless disappear before dignitaries visit the park. He watches tourists take selfies above the dirt where he once lay. He sees everything, but no one sees him. The novel's final pages are not explosive. They are soft, almost imperceptible. A man at the edge of something holy, perhaps, or something empty. He's no longer trying to be remembered. He no longer asks the question. But as readers, we carry it forward. When a child dies, we expect the world to pause. We expect mourning to be public, collective, disruptive. But in Tokyo Ueno Station, the death is quiet. The grief is private. And the father becomes a ghost not just of memory, but of meaning. And this is what I want us to sit with. Not all disappearances are loud. Not all grief is dramatic. Sometimes the greatest tragedy is not what we lose, but what we let vanish without a name. I want to talk about false hope, ghosthood, and the myth of justice in fiction in the following part of these two books. I want to ask, what does literature gain by vanishing its children? And more dangerously, I want to ask, why do we as readers gain by watching? But for now, sit still, listen some more. There is a ghost beneath the cherry blossoms, and he is watching. As we arrive at the quiet close of this first part, I want to invite you, if not to resolution, then at least to stillness. That odd pulsing stillness that both Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line and Tokyo Ueno Station inhabit. A stillness where children vanish, not in a blaze, not in headlines, not even in tragedy as we often define it, but in smoke, in dust, in the folds of system too old or too broken to care. A stillness that refuses to give answers. It just stands there asking, did you even notice that they were gone? And in both novels, the answer is no, not really. In tone and texture, they both are vastly different. One bright with chatter and chaos, the other hushed, sparse, almost funeral like. But both are built around the same wound. Children disappear and the world keeps walking. In Jane Patrol, the disappearance is physical, abrupt, and violent. We hear their names Bahadur, Omveer, Achal. They are classmates, they are voices that fall silent. Jai does what the police should do and what the adults should do. But his search ends not in revelation but in collapse. In Tokyo Ueno Station, the disappearance is temporal. It happens before the book begins. Kazu's son is long buried and yet his absence radiates. It reshapes time, dismantles linearity, erases the borders between memory and place. The father himself becomes untethered from the present, wandering ghost-like through the city that once promised so much and delivered so little. His son's death is never avenged, never even witnessed by society. It becomes a quiet epicenter, a hole in the middle of a novel, a gravitational force that pulls everything else into it. What unites these two narratives is that loss is not only a personal event, it's a systematic outcome. The child's disappearance is not just a family's grief, it's the visible sign of a much larger illness. It is the symptom of a structural failure, poverty, neglect, bureaucracy, and abandonment. These aren't just stories of sadness, they are indictments. They show us in terrible intimacy what happens when the scaffolding of protection collapses and the weight falls where it always does, on the smallest, softest, and the ones who can't push back. And then there are the parents. In both novels, the role of the parent is marked by disorientation. They don't know where to go. They don't know where to go physically, emotionally, symbolically. What does one do with a child who vanishes without explanation, without outrage, without consequences? Parenthood becomes a kind of exile, a condition of non belonging. The parents are not just bereaved, they are erased. They lose not only their children but their place in the social order because our world, as it turns out, is deeply uncomfortable with the ongoing nature of grief. It prefers closure, ritual, a proper narrative arc. These novels refuse all of that. They leave the door open, they leave the light on. And that's where haunting begins. In Jinn Patrol, the haunting is metaphorical. Urban legends of jinns and spirits grow louder in the slum as real answers remain absent. In Ueno Station, the haunting is literal. Kazu is a ghost. He narrates the novel from beyond death, drifting among the living with the quiet sadness of someone who never has had a proper goodbye. These are not ghost stories, but they are stories about what happens when no one listens to the living and the dead are left to speak. So, we arrive at the larger question, one we will carry forward into part 2. Is the child's loss in fiction a symbol of the world's broken ethics? I think it might be. Because in both books, the child does not die because of evil. There is no grand villain, no serial killer to arrest, no one to bring to justice. The children vanish because the system meant to protect them are either indifferent, underfunded, or designed to forget them entirely. They vanish because they are inconvenient, because they are born in the wrong zip code, because someone decided their lives were not profitable enough to preserve. And in that, these novel tells us something deeply uncomfortable. That in our world, innocence is not protected by default. It is protected only when convenient. That is the horror. And that's why these novels haunt. not because what they show, but because what they leave unsaid. We will take this further next time. We will look at the psychological frameworks for ambiguous loss, how fiction uses missing children to test the boundaries of morality and justice, and whether the ghost child is our new tragic archetype in an age of structural failure. But for now, I want you to sit with this silence: a school desk that remains empty, a park bench that holds no weight, a ghost that watches, a mother who stops asking questions, and a boy who thought he could save everyone if only he could draw the right map. Until next time, this has been the Criminal Imagination. Thank you for listening.